Welcome to the VO2 Lounge podcast, the podcast dedicated to making you a faster, stronger, and healthier athlete by using available online scientific literature. In this episode, we'll be discussing why high-intensity work is so important for athletic development. With all the Zone 2 work, it's important we don't lose sight of the need for high intensity. Zone 2 is pretty popular at the moment, and it's almost, I would say, the new hit when it comes to the fitness world. We will discuss what VO2Max is, optimal training for untrained athletes, optimal training for highly trained athletes, and whether more endurance miles make sense, optimizing your training plan as a whole, how hard you need to go during a high intensity interval workout session, whatever you want to call it, and even the science behind a sub-2 marathon. But before, let me just say, if you are new, welcome to the VO2 Lounge. And if this is your second or third time listening, why not consider following the pod and sharing with a friend who would like to learn more about exercise physiology. It must be like VO2 season or something at the moment, because the Real Science of Sport podcast just had a segment on this very subject. One of the papers they reference is in fact one I've lined up in this episode. Some additional sources they mention that were of particular interest include a blog post, at least I think it's a blog post by the looks of things, but it talks about VO2Max and what is required for a 2-hour marathon. The reason I mention it so early on is simply because they put out that 62 to 84 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute is the band at which likely you will need to fall in to achieve the 2-hour marathon. So as we go through this episode, bear it in mind that more is not always necessarily better, in the sense that other factors can play a role. That main factor is the percentage of VO2max that you can sustain for an extended period of time, and they are suggesting that you would need to sustain 94% of VO2max for 2 hours, approximately, but it gives you an idea of what's to come. So I know I've put out a lot of jargon right at the beginning there, but let's bring it back down to basics. And for those who aren't aware, or this is completely new to them other than the word VO2max itself, what is VO2max? So, VO2 goes by many names like maximal oxygen intake or peak oxygen intake, but essentially VO2max is the maximum volume of oxygen that a person can consume or use during exercise. This can be expressed as an absolute value, which is liters per minute. So for example, 4.2, a small number like that is usually, or should be, hopefully, referencing an absolute value. And then you have a relative value, which is much more useful for comparison between athletes, which is milliliters of oxygen per minute per kilogram. So the fact that you now have got kilograms in there, a measurement of the mass of the individual, you now can compare between two athletes who could be drastically different, especially if you're on a bike where someone who's 100 kilos might do 280 watts, and to someone who's 60 kilos, that is a very impressive figure. But when you then compare the two individuals for a relative VO2max, you'll see the performance differences in their oxygen consumption capacity relative to their body mass. Now, typically VO2max tests are conducted in a medical facility or like a lab or a hospital. They can be conducted by a doctor, cardiologist, or some kind of fitness specialist. In athletic and clinical settings, sometimes VO2max can be estimated, assessed through a cycling protocol, walking protocol, or treadmill protocol, due to the expensive equipment required and expertise required to operate the equipment. It's important to note that these are just estimates. For example, the run I'm about to outline can be confounded by the fact that you may be in carbon running shoes, for example, when you perform the test. So carbon shoes versus non-carbon shoes is going to affect how fast you run for no change in your oxygen consumption. Now, smartwatches and apps like HRV for training estimate VO2max based on, in the case of running, your running speed and your heart rate during that running speed, and some other metrics like HRV and heart rate and resting heart rate, and weight, but it obviously needed the weights to get the relative VO2. But again, this can be confounding factors by the presence of carbon shoes. And then cycling is based on power and heart rate. But again, you have confounding factors in the sense that if you look at individuals, yes, you could generally correlate human beings, but we're all going to have at different points in our fitness trajectory, a different heart rate demand for a given power at a given weight across various different conditions. If you start looking into heart rate, for example, weather's going to climate, it's going to affect how that is behaving. You could have a higher heart rate at the same fitness, just in two different environments. And then you also have to consider that we're all, to some extent, a little bit unique, and you don't know where these baseline values are taken from. So if you want a true test, this must be done in a lab where they measure gas in and gas out live as it's happening. So the air you are breathing in, they measure the composition of that. Because they know the composition of that air, the air you're breathing out, and the CO2 concentration and oxygen concentration, how that's changed, you now know that oxygen in versus oxygen out, that is oxygen consumed. You've also got alternatives where they fill a bag effectively as you are exercising, so it's more of a closed system. You breathe in, and when you breathe out, fills a bag, and these can be analysed post-test to determine oxygen consumption at different phases of the test. But for example, you've got things like the Cooper run and you've got other methods, but to calculate an estimate for VO2Max through a running protocol in mil per kick per min, you can use the following formulas, which in kilometers is VO2Max equals 22.351 times the kilometers run minus 11.28. And then for miles, you've got VO2Max equals 35.97 times miles ran minus 11.29. I should mention as well that this is a 12-minute run protocol effectively. So with that out the way, I can get on to the main paper that we'll be looking at for this episode, which, may I add, is a 2002 paper. So things somewhat have moved on, but for the most part, it still highlights very useful insights. It's still extremely relative, and still the mechanisms are still, again, relevant. The paper is titled The Scientific Basis for High Intensity Interval Training. So their abstract essentially is understanding the nuances of training adaptations in highly trained endurance athletes is crucial for optimizing performance, of course. While the effects of submaximal endurance training are well documented, in sedentary and recreational individuals, the picture becomes a little bit murkier when it comes to those already at an advanced level of fitness. Now, the advanced bit here, I think really if you're a runner or cyclist, if you're at the point really where you are really dipping your toes in a form of racing, for the benefit or for the relevance to this paper, you'd really be in that kind of more advanced category, because they're distinguishing between people who have received this kind of HIIT protocol straight off the couch versus people who've already got a foundation of exercise and fitness through years of training, and what is the best protocol for these individuals. Now, interestingly, simply increasing training volume doesn't seem to yield additional benefits for highly trained athletes. Instead, the focus shifts towards high-intensity interval training, which we should all know to some extent, as the primary method for enhancing endurance performance. This shift is supported by research showing that high-intensity training, rather than more volume, is key to further improvement. However, the specific mechanisms behind these improvements are still being unraveled to some extent. Studies examining muscle enzyme activity post-HIIT haven't shown significant changes, suggesting that other factors like skeletal muscle buffering capacity might play more of a significant role. There are numerous areas where further investigation is warranted. Aspects such as changes in plasma volume, stroke volume, muscle cation pumps, and fiber type characteristics remain underexplored in the context of HIIT in highly trained athletes. Additionally, optimizing HIIT programs, especially in terms of interval intensity and duration, requires more focused research. But essentially, that's where this paper is kind of going towards, is essentially the fact that, look, more volume doesn't necessarily elicit the benefits you may think it does, and intensity could be where the future gains are. What I'd think, especially cyclists, I think runners, it can be a little bit different because your goal event duration is actually longer than the professionals, because they're obviously running a marathon in 2 hours, basically, like 2 hours, 3 minutes or whatever, versus you doing it in 3 or 4, or maybe you're pretty elite and you're doing 2:45 or something, for example. But your duration is longer. But cyclists, your duration is guaranteed shorter. Unless you're riding at a pretty elite level, the elites are going to be racing longer distance. For example, a low ranking rider, maybe in Cat 4, 80 kilometers is a pretty standard road race duration. Whereas obviously we all know that elites could be racing over 200 kilometers. And then if you got grand tours, 200 kilometers, 100 and say 20 to 240 kilometers back to back to back to back, with 2 rest days for 21 days or however long a grand tour is, I forget. So it's quite different. Now, if you look at their training, you'd be like, well, surely they'd be doing less volume. But it's important to note that the volume has kind of come down in that World Tour rankings. They have started to reduce that amount of volume that's going on, and this could be possibly to do with the fact that there is more of this focus on the interval work, and so as a result, volumes come down. But I think where it's even more relevant is the fact that if you are not training for 4, 5, 6 hour road races / 5 hour road races where you're having to have a normalized power of 380 watts or something, then maybe 10 hours a week is enough, and you don't need to seek the 15-hour week, and instead you just need to focus on those intervals and how those are distributed. But I digress again. Let's get on to training for untrained and recreational athletes, what they found, what the recommendations are. Let's get into that. So feel free to skip this bit if you feel like you're not an untrained athlete. Rather than splitting these into individual episodes, I just thought I'd keep them all as one and go over each individual component. So what do they have to say? Well, they outline the intricate physiological adaptations triggered by endurance training, particularly spotlight on the aerobic energy system, because this is going to be really downregulated in an individual who is sedentary. They elucidate how adjustments in training variables such as intensity and duration influence specific metabolic pathways and oxygen delivery to the muscle. Through short and long-term studies involving sedentary individuals engaging in daily submaximal training, the narrative sort of unfolds that the enhancement of physical work capacity credited to heightened oxygen delivery and utilization within the muscles. All things you would expect. Now, central adaptations, including a decreased resting heart rate, augmented blood and plasma volume, leading to hypervolemia and an increased cardiac output during exercise, further underscore the body's response to endurance training. It outlines the temporal trajectory of these adaptations, with immediate enhancement in physical work capacity contrasting with the more the protracted timeline required to change in VO2Max and muscle morphology. These are kind of things, especially the stroke volume, cardiac output, blood plasma volume. These are kind of things. I have a detraining episode, and when you become detrained, you'll see your heart rate spike during, say, you come into some high intensity, and that can all return very quickly. And that is, again, when you are new, all these things are going to change really quickly. And it is an interesting thing to monitor. If you have a watch or anything that monitors your resting heart rate, it is kind of cool just to see it drop. I never saw that really happen because I wasn't monitoring any of these things. Usually, the closest I get now is when I come back to training and I'm on the bike. And when it becomes the point that when I'm just riding along to and from work and so on, if I'm not concentrating on keeping the power on, my heart rate doesn't really go over 120. Whereas when I first come back, or I'm coming out of the winter sort of noodle around phase, and it just spikes to 130, 140 without me really trying, those are the kind of things you'll see really, really quickly. Now, beyond the cardiovascular and metabolic shifts, the text delves into the notable adaptations such as a reduction in glucose and muscle glycogen utilization and the optimization of fat metabolism during submaximal exertion. Yet despite these remarkable physiological adaptations, there is a notable plateau in performance improvement among habitual endurance athletes solely through escalating training volume. Now, this doesn't mean, I think there needs to be an element of people knowing what is considered high volume. So if you're a full-blown amateur and you're doing 3 hours a week, one hour ride 3 times a week, then this isn't to say ramp up the intensity and don't worry about riding 5, 6, 7, 8 or 10 hours a week. If you're in that category, if you're in the sub 10, obviously intensity is necessary, but volume is also going to still have a good impact. Then once you get to the point where you're at that level, it's now where it's becoming more like, okay, 15 hours a week, there is going to be improvements. However, this high intensity work and building the work capacity to do more high intensity work is critical. And then the 20-hour week, really, unless you have real high aspirations and going into the more pro, semi-pro ranks, for example, you can then consider these big volume weeks, but habitually trying to cram in 20-hour weeks while you work and so on. Yeah, it is just, don't do it. Now, the discussion then navigates towards the distinctive characteristics of trained muscle, characterized by the heightened oxidative enzyme activity, increased capillaries per muscle fiber, and the predominance of slow twitch fibers. This sets the stage for a crucial realization. Further advancements in endurance performance demand a nuanced approach beyond mere volume escalation. Trained athletes require varied training stimuli to push beyond existing thresholds, and recognition that underscores the complexity and depth of human physiology adaptations to endurance training. And you probably do know somebody who maybe they commute to work, maybe they just like riding long distance. I have known people who it isn't uncommon for them to rack up a 100-mile ride every weekend and maybe do like especially in summer, 60 to 80 kilometer rides in the week, and maybe then like a smaller one. But you then go out with them for a bit of a smash ride and they just haven't got anything about them because simply they haven't trained their body to do that high intensity. And there is only so far that volume in the form of hours alone at zone 2 is going to get you towards your goal, essentially. This is not to say, again, do 3 hours of pure high intensity. It's more that if you're doing 10 hours a week and you're not doing any intensity, figure out how to put some intensity in there before you start adding volume and going to, say, 15 hours a week. It's almost like a stepping stone. So what about high intensity work for these newly trained sedentary individuals? Well, they go on to talk about that, and that part of the paper delves into the transformative effects of high-intensity interval training, or HIIT, on aerobic fitness and endurance performance. Particularly, it highlights the potential to accelerate improvements in individuals who are sedentary or engaged in recreational activity. And traditionally, it was believed that reaching the aerobic capacity seen in elite athletes required years of consistent training. However, recent research suggests that a study by Hicks and al. Challenges this notion by demonstrating substantial increases in VO2Max. They were arguing 44% increase in VO2Max within a relatively short time frame of just 10 weeks through high-intensity exercise sessions alternating between cycling and running at VO2Max levels. Now, I read that, and then obviously my mind goes to, Jesus, okay, if my VO2Max already for 58, 59, and then I could add 44% onto top of that, I'm going to be a pro athlete in no time. Bear in mind, if your VO2Max is already 55 or 60, unless you are just riding 10 hours a week with no intervals on I'd say not even pancake flat terrain, just you're not really pushing over any hills or anything, then this isn't going to happen to you. I imagine in this study, what you'll find is, as they've said, it's sedentary individuals. So maybe they've gone from a VO2Max of 20 to 30 or 30 to 40, for example. So they're still within that sub-elite category, hence why it's possible. It's the most training their body will ever have seen if you're a good responder, so on and so forth. So if you're someone who's already heavily trained, take that with a pinch of salt and don't think that you're going to be Lance Armstrong by next week, or should I say in 10 weeks. But beyond mere time efficiency, HIIT also offers metabolic advantages over continuous exercise. Intermittent exercise, characterized by brief, intense bursts followed by short rest periods, promotes increased lipid utilization and decreased glycogen depletion compared to continuous exercise. This divergence in metabolic pathways suggests that a manner in which exercise is structured can significantly impact the body's fuel utilization and subsequent adaptations that come from it. In terms of physiological changes, HIIT has also particular efficacy in enhancing oxidative capacity in type 2 muscle fibers. So the fiber type that you normally associate with being incredibly glycolytic, hence its ability to turn over energy quickly, utilize energy quickly, produce incredibly high force relative to its type 1 counterpart. So it's making it more type 1-esque, effectively. Now, which is typically associated with anaerobic metabolism, as I've said. This finding suggests that HIIT may induce adaptations that bridge the gap between aerobic and anaerobic energy systems, potentially contributing to the overall performance gains. And this would kind of make sense to some essence, because if you look at it in a sense that if you're doing continuously steady state aerobic work, the type 2 fibers aren't being stressed effectively. They're in the same building as the type 1s, but only so many phones are ringing. So they're like, I don't need to answer any of these because the type 1 fibers have got this all under control. But then suddenly all the phones start ringing and there's way too many calls coming in for the type 1 fibers to cope with. So the type 2 fibers are now like, I better answer some calls here. And so essentially that's what it looks like it's doing. You are leaning so far out of the remit of the type 1 fiber, or at least overloading it to the point the type 2 fiber has to get its act together and actually support the effort when it's not an anaerobic or an extremely exhaustive, high force producing effort. It has to get involved. And as a result, it goes, I can't be this glycolytic and support this work. So it becomes less glycolytic and starts becoming more fat oxidative capable. Now, The comparison between continuous training and HIIT training reveals mixed findings regarding their respective effects on enzyme activity and adaptation markers. While continuous training has demonstrated improvements in citrate synthase or CS activity, HIIT may lead to a greater enhancement in adenylate kinase activity and other markers. This outlines the complexity of the body's response to different training stimuli and highlights the need for tailored approaches to maximize training outcomes. Stuff like that you don't really have to worry about. Essentially, you're going to see the power change or the running speed change and go from there. Now, recent research comparing continuous running with HIIT among recreational runners provides further insights. Although continuous running appeared to yield greater improvements in VO2Max and time to exhaustion compared to shorter HIIT sessions, these findings may be influenced by the participants' initial fitness levels, and it emphasizes the importance of considering individual baseline fitness when evaluating training interventions. And that, I think, is a really key point that could be overlooked, is that although the high intensity work is lifting that ceiling of VO2, the amount of oxygen you can physically get in, it's no good if your time to exhaustion is really low, which is what this baseline fitness appears to do. So it's almost like you need both, because you need to be able to have the engine to actually produce the peak power or the steady state power, but then you also need that aerobic system to keep it up, right, and keep the power going through long sustained efforts, which is where this on a poorly trained individual could result in impressive figures from a standpoint of peak output, but less impressive figures when it comes to what percentage of their VO2 max can they operate at a prolonged period of time. Now, studies investigating repeat supermaximal HIIT in untrained individuals have shown significant enhancements in muscle enzyme activity, anaerobic power output, total work done, and VO2 max. These findings highlight the multifaceted benefits of HIIT, which extend beyond more improvements in aerobic capacity. I think really the takeaway from this section to me was, if you are sedentary and you're someone who doesn't really like exercise so much, and then it's daunting thinking that to get a good VO2 max I need to do 10 hours a week of exercise. Reality is you can probably have one high intensity, really high intensity exercise bout, or maybe two, and then just have 1 or 2 zone 2 days. So mix them up how you want, but essentially you could get away with 3 days of some kind of continuous training on the bike, running, whatever it is, and then only one of those days really needs to be ultra high intensity to really bump up that VO2 max. But now we are going to go on to elite riders. This is the bit most people who've probably found this episode are interested in. So welcome. If you have skipped forward to this point, don't worry about anything I previously said. You haven't missed out on anything, because all the information for you is going to be here. And for those who listened through the amateur section, we have now arrived at the point that is probably of interest to you. So elite riders, they start this section of the paper with the following text. Many exercise scientists base their advice to athletes on training principles developed from studies completed with previously untrained or occasionally active individuals. As shown in the previous section, this is problematic. Research has consistently shown that endurance training in previously untrained individuals will increase VO2 max, capillary density, oxidative enzyme activity, and plasma volume. However, changes in these variables do not occur when already highly trained athletes increase the volume of their submaximal training. Indeed, endurance training athletes and untrained individuals do not show the same response to submaximal continuous training, which should be clear to some extent. You wouldn't expect the two, but in some cases, people do transfer those two training principles across from sub-elites to semi-elite / highly trained individuals. So submaximal training for elite riders. Submaximal, in the name, everything there is submaximal. Now, sometimes you could also consider it as being like those steady state longer intervals, like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40, 50 minutes, or even an hour. I use them quite a lot at the beginning of like January time. When I first come back, I've done a little bit of volume, and then I'm coming in, and I find it's a great way of just getting that endurance ticking along in a much shorter, compressed format, rather than going out for 4 or 5 hours. Just do 2-3 hours, and one of those hours is just at that sort of limit of submaximal effort. Now, in the paper, they highlight a critical concept in endurance training: the diminishing returns of further increasing submaximal training volume once a high level of aerobic capacity, VO2Max, that is greater than 60 mil per kg per min has been achieved. The study by Costel and colleagues demonstrated that doubling the swim training distance over a short period didn't lead to improvements in swimming performance, aerobic capacity, or muscle metabolic activity, and this suggests that athletes who are already well trained may have reached a plateau in their metabolic adaptations to submaximal endurance training. Now, it's obviously really conflicting, and obviously this paper is a little bit old, 20 plus years. But I suppose it's a good metric to go by. If you're someone who's, got the finances to go to a lab and get a VO2Max test, or your estimate metrics are surpassing that 60, or you're very close, then it could mean that whatever volume you're currently at, you don't need to surpass that volume. The bit that's conflicting is obviously you have athletes in different sports, whether that's cycling, triathlon, whether you've got things like the Lifetime Grand Prix, where lately it seems to be 40-hour weeks of the new bloody craze. Is it just the fact that the individual who's spiked people's interest in these huge, massive blocks just happens to be that bit better anyway, and it's not necessarily the massive blocks that are actually leading to these adaptions? I don't know. But this was a useful metric for me to go, look, if your VO2Max is already in this realm, then maybe volume's not the answer. You can still give it a go, but don't invest an 8-week block of trying to elevate that volume, expecting huge changes. But I don't know. It's still a bit unclear which is actually required. Now, a meta-analysis conducted by Laundrie et al. Supports this notion. They found that continuous training at exercise intensities corresponding to ventilatory or lactate threshold failed to elicit additional improvements in highly trained athletes. However, the authors noted that trained individuals might respond better to high-intensity training as a result. Essentially, once athletes reach a level of training, further increases in submaximal training volume may not lead to significant improvements in performance or physiological variables. Instead, focusing on high-intensity training might be more beneficial. That is where you get that glimmer of understanding / hope of maybe the reason that an elite rider is going from 15 to 20 or 25 hours a week is because they've initially maxed out that amount of endurance work, then they've gone to max out the high intensity work, and now they're at 15 hours a week, say for example, but they still need to improve. So the only volume they can tag on is just baseline endurance work. So that's what you tag on to get the final few percent. But when you're an individual who's not full-time, then prioritizing the maximization of a certain amount of basic volume and then the high intensity work is likely going to be the priority focus that you should have. So what about high intensity interval training for these highly trained individuals? Now, incorporating high intensity work into training regimes of highly trained endurance athletes is a strategy that has garnered significant attention and adoption within the athletic community. Of course, as we know, typically, training programs for elite endurance athletes are structured to include distinct phases, with high-intensity work often being integrated as athletes approach their competitive seasons. This structured approach begins with an initial phase aimed at building an aerobic base, which lays the foundation for subsequent training adaptations, As the competitive season nears, the focus shifts towards intensifying training, with high intensity sessions becoming a central component. You could see anywhere from 2 to 3 a week. I know running can be a bit different with double days and so on, but let's just stick to like 2 or maybe 3 depending on training volume. Now, despite coaches historically employing high intensity training to enhance the performance of elite endurance athletes, the scientific understanding of its underlying physiological mechanisms has only recently begun to emerge. Researchers have embarked on investigations aimed at unveiling the intricate metabolic demands and performance outcomes associated with HIIT in this population. Now, studies exploring the metabolic responses have uncovered some interesting findings. It's been observed that high intensity work elicits high rates of carbohydrate oxidation, a crucial energy pathway for sustained performance, alongside a progressive increase in fat oxidation throughout the duration of training sessions. These metabolic adaptations likely contribute to the improved performance observed following these high intensity bouts. Researchers have consistently documented enhancement in various performance metrics following high intensity sessions. These improvements encompass a wide range of parameters, including respiratory exchange ratio, recovery heart rate, ventilatory threshold, and peak power output. And importantly, these performance gains extend beyond laboratory settings and have been demonstrated to translate into enhanced performance across different endurance activities such as running and cycling over various distances. While HIIT yields positive effects on certain laboratory-based markers of endurance performance, such as ventilatory threshold and peak power output, it's important on the other parameters such as economy of motion and maximal oxygen uptake, so VO2Max, appear to be more variable and less consistently observed. Now, researchers proposed at this time several potential mechanisms throughout which HIIT may enhance endurance performance, and these include its influence on sustainable fractional utilization of VO2Max, so something I mentioned earlier about that operating at a high percentage, improvements in movement efficiency and alterations in oxygen delivery and utilization process within working muscles. However, further research is needed to understand the precise physiological pathways through which HIIT exercise is affected and how it's affected. So we'll go through central and peripheral adaptations and kind of outline what exactly it is that is occurring as a result of these high intensity bouts. So central adaptations to endurance training play a pivotal role in enhancing the delivery of oxygen to working muscles, a critical factor in sustaining high intensity exercise performance. Now, despite the fact that maximal heart rate tends to remain unchanged following endurance training, improvements in oxygen delivery during high intensity exercise primarily stem from an increase in stroke volume. Stroke volume refers to the amount of blood ejected by the heart with each contraction, and its augmentation is key to enhancing cardiovascular efficiency. It's just the size of that pump, essentially. This augmentation in stroke volume can occur through two primary mechanisms. Now, firstly, an increase in the contractile force of the left ventricle, that is the left side of the heart. And then secondly, an elevation in cardiac filling pressure leading to greater end systolic volume and consequently higher stroke volume. This kind of highlights the fact that if some alien species turned up and probed us without us knowing, and they were to just watch us exercise, they'd think that it was bad for you because you've got heightened blood pressure, you've got heightened heart rate, your core temperature's increasing, blood glucose is doing all sorts of things. You would honestly be like, do not do this. This is bad for you. Inflammation's up. Oxidative stress is up. Why would you do this? But then if they instrumented you over the long run and looked at various human beings and the ones that didn't and did exercise, you'd realize, this small proportion of that individual's day that's causing this incredibly heightened state of stress actually doesn't seem to have a negative impact, or their same biomarkers or the same variables we're looking at are now reduced significantly from the sedentary human beings. Now, these adaptations are fundamental to optimizing oxygen delivery to working muscles, thereby supporting prolonged endurance exercise performance. However, despite the critical role of stroke volume in cardiovascular function, potential alterations in stroke volume and plasma volume following high-intensity interval training in highly trained athletes have not been extensively explored. This represents a gap in the understanding of cardiovascular adaptations to high-intensity training, particularly considering the maximal oxygen uptake closely linked to maximal cardiac output often shows minimal changes following HIIT in highly trained athletes. Now, plasma volume expansion induced either through training or heat acclimation is regarded as a vital mechanism for promoting cardiovascular stability, enhancing thermoregulation during prolonged exercise. This is something I've actually covered in one of my previous episodes on the benefits and the methods around hot and cold exposure, and it talks about this as one of the benefits of the increased stroke volume as a result and cardiac output as a result of heat acclimation. This expansion helps to mitigate cardiovascular stress by maintaining arterial and venous pressures, ultimately preserving or improving stroke volume. However, the impact of artificial plasma volume expansion on stroke volume is highly trained athletes who typically possess higher plasma volume levels remain less clear. Another potential avenue through which HIIT may enhance endurance performance in highly trained individuals is via improvements in heat tolerance. While HIIT sessions are typically conducted under controlled thermal conditions, the high intensity nature of the exercise can lead to elevated or significantly elevated core temperature when you compare it to just baseline movements. Endurance training induced plasma volume expansion partially acclimatizes individuals to heat stress, potentially enhancing their ability to regulate temperature during subsequent exercise bouts. However, research in this area is limited and further investigation is warranted. I actually have an episode again on this very topic of heat acclimation, how it can be performance enhancing, so on and so on. And again, in addition to the central adaptations, peripheral changes in muscle physiology also contribute significantly to enhance endurance performance. These adaptations involve improvements in ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the little energy currency of the muscle, production and utilization within working muscles, ultimately enhancing muscular endurance. However, existing research on peripheral adaptations in HIIT primarily focus on untrained or recreationally active individuals, leaving a gap in the understanding of how these adaptations manifest in highly trained individuals. This is a general trend that most studies you read, a lot of the time there's a gap in knowledge on elite athletes because pinning them down can be quite hard for a prolonged period of time for something that may be a detriment to their end performance. So essentially, while central adaptations such as stroke volume enhancement are crucial for optimizing oxygen delivery during endurance exercise, the specific effects of HIIT on these adaptations in highly trained athletes remain underexplored. Now, additionally, understanding peripheral changes in muscle physiology post-HIIT could provide valuable insight into the mechanisms underlying enhanced endurance performance in this population. Now, again, they just state further research is needed. So next, we'll talk about high intensity program enhancement and optimization. Now, we've spoken a lot about high intensity interval training and why it's so important and what the adaptations are that come as a result of high intensity training. But how do you go about setting up a program and optimizing that program for maximal benefit to yourself? So optimizing high intensity interval training programs for highly trained endurance athletes requires a multifaceted approach that considers various key factors to tailor the training stimulus to each individual athlete and their goals. Let's explore these elements a bit more then. So first and foremost, selecting the right exercise intensity is crucial. While several physiological measures can guide this selection, focusing on the velocity at which VO2Max is achieved, the Vmax, has emerged as a practical and effective metric by pushing athletes to exercise at or above their VO2 max. Further improvements in aerobic capacity can be then realized. This is something that I think only really works for runners, really, because you could go on a treadmill and run at Vmax through a VO2max test, and then from then on out you know where this value lies. Whereas a cyclist, the speed you're riding is so variable, dependent on wind, depending on like tarmac, bike, elevation, so on and so forth, that it's not really as useful a metric. But you could substitute it for knowing what your power output at VO2max is, and then utilize that instead of Vmax. Interval duration is another critical consideration. Something there's multiple different interval durations. Since the time to exhaustion at Vmax, which is Tmax, varies among athletes, using a fraction of Tmax, for example 60% of Tmax, as the interval duration ensures that athletes train at a high intensity relative to their individual capacity. This approach provides a standardized yet adaptable framework for interval prescription. Incorporating metrics related to distance covered at high intensity during HIIT sessions adds depth to interval training optimization. Athletes who cover a fraction of their Tmax distance during intervals, along with appropriate work to rest ratios, have shown significant performance improvements. And then this underlines the importance of considering both time-based and distance-based variables in high-intensity training programs design. Recovery strategies are equally crucial. Tailoring the duration and type of recovery based on individual response and training status ensures optimal physiological adaptations while balancing stimulus and recovery. And additionally, integrating high-intensity interval training into periodized training plan aligns training intensity and volume with the athlete's competitive season and performance targets. That's obvious. You don't want to basically finish your season, start doing high intensity, and then build volume before the season. That would be reverse periodization, but essentially for someone doing criterium racing, road racing, marathons, anything of that where it's fairly high intensity, you're going to want to bring the intensity closer to the goal event. And before that, you can focus on volume optimization and aerobic development. But I found that this paper in particular, the recommendations were a little bit kind of here or there. It was like, obviously this Vmax and Tmax, but it wasn't giving standardized just durations like 8 minutes, 4 minutes, 2 minutes, 30 20s, 20 10s, so on and so forth. But a paper titled Higher Fraction of VO2max Duration Interval Training, a higher fraction of VO2max during interval training, the greater gains in performance. This is the paper I mentioned before that the Real Science of Sport podcast covered in their most recent episode. Now, this is the source that I think provides a good indication. Now, it explores the significance of exercising at intensities near the body's maximal oxygen consumption, which is VO2max, in enhancing endurance performance. High-intensity interval training is highlighted as an effective modality for achieving this, with the fraction of VO2max achieved during HIIT sessions and the time sustained at durations equal to or greater than 90% of VO2max being proposed as a criteria for session effectiveness. While the concept is widely accepted, scientific evidence supporting it has been lacking. The present study aims to fill this gap by continuously measuring VO2max during a HIIT session throughout a 9-week exercise training intervention in cyclists. And bearing in mind, this is a recent study. I think it was 2020. I tell a lie. It was actually 2023. So it was October 2023 when it was published, received slightly beforehand, but a very recent paper. So showing that there is still conflicting data and still no clear outline as to what the hell's going on. Now, 22 participants underwent an intervention, performing HIIT sessions consisting of 5 by 8 minute intervals and average power output corresponding to their individual maximal power output. VO2 was measured continuously during work periods in each high-intensity session, and psychological tests, including physiological tests, including blood lactate profile, VO2Max tests, and a 15-minute time trial were conducted before and after the intervention. The results revealed that a positive relationship between the average fraction of VO2Max achieved during HIIT sessions, so percentage of VO2Max high intensity, and improvements in various performance indicators, including maximal power output, power at full millimole, power output at full millimole, blood lactate, essentially. You'll have heard of it if you've watched any of things, especially like the Norwegian method videos. They'll talk about lactate a lot, but essentially for the time being, exercise time at full millimole, the performance index, and VO2max. Now, specifically, a higher percentage of VO2max exercise during the interval was associated with greater improvements in WMAX, which is maximal power output, at 4 millimole, and performance index and VO2max. Notably, there was no significant relationship between percentage of VO2max worked out at and changes in gross efficiency at 175 watts. So it's suggesting that no significant changes low down, but your ability at the top end is drastically improved. The study then concludes that optimizing high-intensity sessions to elicit a high percentage of VO2 max per high-intensity interval may lead to enhanced endurance performance. This finding provides valuable insight into applied exercise physiology, emphasizing the practical significance of tailoring HIIT protocols to achieve optimal physiological responses. The awkward thing about cycling to some extent is the fact that what you want to be able to do is the studies are always going to lag the actual what's going on in the field, because studies require funding, ethics, so on and so forth. Whereas in the real world, an individual can go, I'm going to try this for 6 weeks, or a coach can say, we're going to try this for 8 weeks. If it works, we stick with it. So you'd want to try replicate what professionals are doing. But the problem is, because professionals are doing such high volumes, it is a bit hard to really tailor and figure out how you titrate that to our respective volume. Now, it is worth noting that I have got a previous episode called What Are the Most Effective Training Intervals? HIIT Science Explained. In there, I go into various other papers, but in less detail. This is one of the papers covered. It's worth noting that there is one of them titled Tabata Training, one of the most energetically effective high-intensity intermittent training methods, where they perform Tabata exercises where it's 7 to 8 sets of 20 seconds of exercise, essentially to exhaustion, and then a 10-second cool down. Like, this is a real maximal effort, and you're doing 7 to 8 of these in a block, followed by some rest, and then you can do another block. There's also a paper titled Optimal Training Intensity of Enhancing a Maximal Oxygen Uptake of Distance Runners. Again, sort of facilitating the idea that a higher percentage of VO2 max is going to elicit greater responses. And then you also have 2 other papers that both outline the fact that these shorter exercise durations, when matched when effectively volume matched. So they're not doing the same amount of time per each interval, because one was 4x16, one was 4x8, one was 4x4. They effectively balance them and decrease the duration, but increase the intensity. And they found that 4x4 was the most effective at increasing VO2 max. And then same for another paper using similar distributions, did not include a 4-minute effort, but did include the 8-minute effort, and also saw increases. So essentially, these shorter efforts are going to be key to improving exercise performance. And how hard do you need to go? You need to go pretty hard, essentially. I think failing a workout is a sign that you are in the right kind of realm. Yes, you need to back it off a little bit, but you're definitely in the right realm. Whereas if you're finishing a 5 by 8 minute session and you get to the end and you're like, yeah, that dusted that off, it's probably not hard enough. So as I was literally writing this all up, I had somewhat of a moment of clarity or an epiphany or a thought process. You have many pros who say you can't replicate racing and you can only prepare for it when it comes to road racing in particular, and criteriums as well. But in general, you'll hear pros say that it was good to get a hard race in the legs because you simply just can't prepare for that kind of stuff. And I'd have to agree, having very recently, like the last weekend, competed in my first road race of the season. There's just something about the environment that leads to such a high level of continuous effort that I just don't think can be, or at least easily replicated in training environment that frequently. I sometimes have 2 races per week, and I don't think I could dig that deep twice a week in a solo setting where I'm doing intervals. And the stimulus is definitely not a placebo. It's just looking at my power trajectory through the race season last year. It far outweighs anything I've achieved in training in previous years. Yes, this could be a point of growth as I've hit, say, 5 years of consistent training, or it could just simply be that this is a defining moment of a reasonably high volume of high intensity work. A possible explanation for this could be how racing tends to keep you at a very high percentage of your VO2Max for a prolonged period of time, where much of the time is spent sort of under that VO2Max threshold. But then there are also these huge efforts that take you way over your capacity, and you're doing either at VO2Max or you're obviously at VO2Max, but then the power continues to creep past that and pushes you into that zone. And it could be eliciting those those benefits. And prior to sort of reading through these, a lot of the information sort of suggested that, information from training platforms, for example, like Trainer Road, where they're suggesting that although racing is useful, training is the key, which, yes, okay, completely agree in the sense that training, you can't just turn up to a race. But intervals over actual racing, it looks like, because you are having these such short breaks, usually between ramping straight back up to VO2Max, it looks like if you were to be able to monitor yourself throughout the session, that you'd be teetering very close to VO2Max for a lot of that, especially if it's a 2-hour race. It's a bit like a 2-hour marathon where they're talking about 94% of VO2Max. You could be right there, essentially. Obviously undulating, but you get the idea. What's your takeaway from this then? Mine is that maybe rather than at this point of year, I'll have my first race and then I'll try build some, almost like a little training camp where I incorporate racing and an increased volume. To be honest, I think I'll stick with the 10 to 13 hours a week kind of volume and prioritize 1, the race, and 2, a secondary high intensity session that will effectively push me through into the main season with hopefully as much fitness as possible. And then through there, it will just be about maintenance. If I have 2 races a week, obviously no high intensity. And if I have only 1 race, then possibly a small tune up, but only if I'm feeling particularly flat. Once I hit that point in the season, fitness can increase, but the only way it's going to be increasing through high intensity is predominantly through racing because of the volume of races that will come within that calendar. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics at the VO2Lounge@gmail.com or in the VO2 Lounge Discord server. Links all down below. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it's goodbye.